It is no secret that our personality is shaped in many ways, especially in the first years of life. Personality development is particularly influenced by factors such as environment and upbringing. Many of the cases I have dealt with show that criminals are shaped from an early age. For example, some are abused by their parents or other relatives. But there are also cases that are primarily due to a lack of parental care. One example of this is the case of Jaime Cardenas, known as Jimmy. Jaime Cardenas Pardo was born on April 9, 1987 in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. His parents were divorced. Apart from him, they had 9 other children. Jaime had a peaceful childhood. He was never exposed to aggression from his parents. It can only be said that, like other children growing up in large families, he did not receive the attention he needed from his father and mother. So the young man was almost completely on his own. For a long time, he roamed the streets without returning home and came into contact with members of a local gang, who gradually drew him into the criminal world. At the age of 11, he began drinking alcohol and consuming illegal substances. The older he got, the less his parents cared about him. By the age of 14, Jaime had already tried almost every illegal substance available on the street. In November of the year 2001, the young man began committing crimes. First, he decided to steal a cell phone from a drunk man in order to sell it and buy alcohol with the proceeds. Later, the petty thefts became more frequent. This was mainly due to the fact that Jaime was unemployed and needed money. At the age of 17, the young man committed his first murder. He tried to rob a passerby with a knife, but the passerby fought back. He then lost control and fatally injured his opponent. The man died. Jaime fled the scene in a hurry, but it turned out that several people remembered his appearance. The young man was soon arrested. When the police did not find any of Jaime's papers during the search, they asked him his age, to which he replied with undisguised sarcasm, "I'm a minor." Jaime was eventually released, even though he had confessed to the crime. The young murderer then realized that the police had let him go mainly because of his age. In short, he realized that he could use this opportunity to continue committing crimes. After some time, the young man met a former policeman who had been dismissed because he had been involved in the escape of a prisoner from San Roque prison. In October of that year, the new acquaintance was in the Bolivian capital. There they met young students named Marta Delgado and Nairobi Munoz. The young people drank and had fun for a few hours, but then the situation got out of hand. Under the influence of alcohol and illegal drugs, the men decided to force their new girlfriends to commit inhumane acts. The ladies then threatened to call the police. Jaime reacted violently to the threats and mutilated their faces with a knife. He then took some large stones and beat his victims with them until they died. Their bodies were found on October 11th. It turned out that the victims were the girlfriends of a big businessman who dealt in luxury cars. When he learned of what had happened, he began to use his channels to find out who had committed such a brutal crime. This put him on the trail of a man with the nickname Jimmy. This nickname was none other than Jaime. He found out that this man was an alcoholic, used illegal substances and made his living by robbing people. He also found out that he had a 4-year-old son. This gave him the idea of avenging the death of his girlfriends in the most brutal way. He hired men to kidnap the little boy as he was leaving a store. A few days later, Jaime's son was found dead. The victim of the revenge was not the murderer himself, but his own son. Since then, Jaime has been full of rage. His behavior has changed for the worse, if I may say so, and his criminal activities have greatly increased. He often acted without thinking, with great desire, and did not shy away from attacking innocent people, killing them, and then stealing their property. He was arrested several times in connection with this, but as his profits from the thefts increased, he managed to bribe the police officers and was released. On February 17th, the young man was in La Paz. He roamed the streets in search of a new victim and finally found one. The perpetrator pulled out a knife and tried to rob the defenseless woman of her belongings. When she fought back, Jaime stabbed her several times. Fortunately, the wounds were not deep and the woman survived. The attacker tried to flee. During his escape,
I can do
he
it
was
myself.
observed by several people who immediately informed the police and pressed charges. The perpetrator was eventually arrested. After his arrest, the man confessed to having been involved in more than 30 murders. The police officers were very surprised that the young man was able to remain at large for so long. He told them that he was friends with many police officers who turned a blind eye and let him go in exchange for a small bribe. He also added that he had done some illegal favors for these corrupt policemen from time to time. During his detention in prison, Jaime underwent several psychological and psychiatric examinations, during which it was determined that he did not suffer from a personality disorder. The experts described him as a man who had committed all his atrocities responsibly. They described him as a premeditated and aggressive serial killer with the traits of a true predator. He killed without hesitation, like an animal in search of food. On December 6th of that year, Jaime was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder and incitement to intimacy of Marta Delgado and Nairobi Munoz. His accomplice, a former police officer, received a similar sentence. It turned out that the authorities had decided not to investigate any other crimes and to pass sentence on this case alone. When Jaime heard the verdict, he was furious. He got up from his seat, picked up a plastic water bottle, threw it at the prosecutor, and shouted threats at her. He said he would take revenge on her as soon as he managed to escape from prison. Shortly afterwards, the perpetrator was imprisoned in San Roque prison in an isolated solitary cell, the so-called well. After just a few months, the young man unexpectedly managed to escape. He used a short break to go to the toilet, then climbed over a wire fence and got into a waiting silver van. Yes, that sounds incredible. The security authorities then carried out a series of unsuccessful searches throughout the city. Eventually, the authorities concluded that the perpetrator may have fled the country in time. The search for Jaime dragged on for several months. The Bolivian authorities even called in Interpol. In the meantime, the prison staff responsible for the escape were prosecuted and suspended until the circumstances were explained. The fugitive was not caught until the 3rd of May. He was staying at his mother's house in the small provincial town of Iacumo in northern Bolivia. After his arrest, he was taken to Chonchogoro prison, where he served his sentence. Jaime Cardenas has since grown up and turned to religion. He regrets his past life and says he no longer wants to remember it. On his social media page, he loudly proclaims that he was saved by God. In the mid-1990s, mass disappearances of children began in Colombia. Some of them were found, but nothing was known about many of them. The worst thing was that it didn't happen in one particular place, but in different regions of the country. At first, the police dealt with all these cases individually. Each place where the children disappeared had its own law enforcement agency, which conducted an investigation without knowing that there were similar cases in other cities. Time passed, the number of victims grew, and the police were alerted. They did not know what to expect. All the victims were boys between the ages of 8 and 14. They all came from families with a low social status and lived in poor conditions. These children had to work to help their parents. Many of them sold sweets and lottery tickets to pay for their education. It all began in the year, often in 70 villages. There were more and more reports of missing persons. Quindio, Risaralda, Caldas, Valle del Cauca, Nariño, Boyaca. All these areas of Colombia were affected. There was also unrest in the capital. Law enforcement agencies worked day and night to give families an answer as to what had happened to their children. But as time went on, more questions emerged than answers. As mentioned earlier, each missing person case was initially looked at individually. Everything changed over the decades and decades. Then mass graves began to be found with skeletons belonging to children. Many of these skeletons were without skulls. It was therefore assumed that some victims had been beheaded. The first burial site was found in Nasaderos, in the town of Pereira, in the capital of the department of Risaralda. Something eerie was discovered there. A boy was riding a horse across a field in Nasaderos when he suddenly noticed a burial site in which there were It was initially unclear whether they were human bones or belonged to animals. But when the police arrived and looked at the site, it became clear that they were human bones. The scariest thing was that the bones were very small, so it was assumed that they belonged to children. Of course, this had to be investigated further to be sure. Around 14 skeletons were found in this first burial site. Soon more graves were found in the surrounding area. There were 12 skeletons in one burial site, but only 9 skulls. All the skeletons had skin remains and pieces of clothing on them. But something was striking. Many had a large rope or remnants of it around their necks. It was a shocking find. Law enforcement had to review data from previous cases to understand what they were dealing with. They began to connect one with the other, and early in the years they found another grave in a place called Villa Olímpica, also in the Nasaderos area. 4 children's skulls were found there. Other such graves were also found. A total of 9 burial sites with 40 skeletons were found at the time. It was determined that the bones had been underground for around 5 years. Graves were found in Valle del Cauca, Antioquia, Bogotá, and Quindio. In Valle del Cauca, there were 2 more finds afterwards. A further 7 children were found in Tuluá. However, there was no thorough investigation. It is also known that a grave with the same number of children's skeletons was found in Sassal in November of the year. Apart from the task of finding out who was behind it, the police had another major problem. It was necessary to identify the remains of all the children. There were only skulls and a few bones. It was very difficult to determine who they belonged to. To find out, DNA tests had to be carried out. The problem was that these tests were very expensive at the time. There were a lot of children's remains that needed to be identified, and there wasn't enough money. It was then decided to turn to experts in facial reconstruction of skulls, but it remained very difficult. In addition, there was no standard for facial reconstruction on children at the time. The problem is that children do not yet have mature facial features during the growth process. The shape of the face can only be determined during puberty. The distance between the eyes, the size of the nose. Then an expert began to measure all the facial features in order to find a kind of pattern. A few weeks later, he succeeded and was able to recreate the faces of many children. It also helped that the children's faces were very androgynous, and he could use the morphological standards that were used for women. Unfortunately, too many skulls were missing, and some of those were in very poor condition. For these, the police had to carry out a DNA test. Although a lot of information was found about children, their families were not found. To this day, the identity of many remains unknown. After working on restoring the children's faces, the police had to focus on their investigation. It was determined that it all started near Genova. They began to think about what connected all these localities. Nothing was known about the murderer. It was a man or a woman. The police didn't know where to start. All that was known was that the victims were roughly the same age, and after the facial reconstruction, it was clear that they also resembled each other externally. The same ropes were always used, and a bottle of strong alcohol of the same brand was found everywhere. In some cases, wax residue was also found. At the time, no one knew what they were dealing with. There was an assumption that maybe it had something to do with satanic rituals. They also thought it might have been retribution among drug lords. The possibility that it was social cleansing was also considered, but these hypotheses were quickly dismissed. The police realized that they were dealing with a serial killer. The months passed, and on February 6th, a new murder was recorded, this time in Balmeda. They found a child similar to the previous victims. Many details were found at the crime scene: shoes, a pair of glasses, a wad of money. Tests were carried out in the laboratory. These gave the police many clues and leads as to who the suspect might be. The shoes were rather masculine, so it was assumed that the murderer was a man. The right shoe was found to have unusual wear in the heel area. This indicated that the man was limping on that leg. The front of the shoes was not worn at all. Therefore, it was assumed that the shoes were larger than the man's actual shoe size. Thanks in part to the shoe wear, it was possible to determine the approximate size, between 165 and 167. The glasses were analyzed, especially the lenses, to find out what vision the man had in order to estimate his approximate age. According to the specialist who analyzed the glasses, the person wearing them could be 40 to 45 years old, or 55 to 60 years old. So the police stuck with the 40 to 60 range. Now they had at least some characteristics of the suspect. The bills were also useful. By number and series, they could be tracked to where they were sent first, to the town on the border with Ecuador. Payments with these banknotes were made throughout Colombia. It became clear that this man was traveling all over the country. Finally, the police had everything they needed to further narrow down the circle of suspects. The police used a list of sex offenders that matched the above characteristics. In the end, they had 25 suspects. But there was one more thing that needed to be added. There was evidence of a small fire at the site where the boy's body was found. Therefore, burns could be on the killer's body, leg, hand, or right side. With all this information, the police launched a search for 25 suspects to find out where they were at the time of the murders. The first person to be arrested was Pedro Ramirez Garcia, nicknamed Pedro Pechuga. He had a rich criminal past, including robberies and molesting teenagers. At the time of his arrest, he was wanted because 2 children were missing, whose ages were similar to the other victims. A boy also identified him as his rapist. Pedro Pechuga declared that he was innocent of the murders for which he was charged. He said he was only to blame for the boy who recognized him and the other 2 who were missing. He asserted that he had not traveled through Colombia looking for boys he could harm. The arrest of Pedro Pechuga not only did not bring peace, but caused even more uncertainty. While Pedro was in prison awaiting the results of the investigation, 4 other children were found in Bogota. The police had to drop the charges. Pedro Pechuga was the first person to be convicted of these crimes. In the early years of the investigation, the police had their own suspects in each district. The same thing happened again and again in Bogota. A man named Javier Garcia Dinoco was arrested. The mother of one of the missing children said that she had had conflicts with Dinoco over the land. and that he may have been getting even with her. He also looked like a composite picture taken by a girl who had seen him with one of the missing children hours before the disappearance. Garcia Dinoco pleaded not guilty. He spent a year in prison while he awaited trial. He was not doing well there. Other prisoners wanted to get back at him for what he had done to children. He said he had been abused there. He was released again and again because a hair test proved his innocence. But there was a miscarriage of justice. When he was in prison, even before the hair test, the judge had already convicted him, so he had to go back to prison and spend a few years there until everything was cleared up. It later became known that Javier Garcia Dinoco met the real perpetrator face to face. When it became clear that Pedro Pechuga was innocent and that there were no other suspects, the chief investigator of the case traveled to Bogotá. He had previously carried out the investigation from Bereda. There he began to search for registered cases similar to the last case involving disappearing children. He found the case of a 12-year-old boy named Ronaldo Delgado. He had been abused and killed. The details were very similar to the case that was being investigated at the time. The incident took place in Duña, 60 kilometers from Bogotá. There were witnesses in Ronaldo's case. Some said they had seen the boy talking to a man hours before he disappeared. They were employees of a cafe located near the place where the boy's body was later found. A sketch of the suspect was made based on the descriptions of these people, and the police were able to find him. It was Luis Alfredo Garavito Cuvillos. This man had been in the city for a short time, and only a few people knew him. But during the interrogation, nothing could be found to prove his guilt. He had an alibi and said he had been with friends in a nearby bar. No one could confirm this, but there was no evidence against him either, so the police had to release him. After that, the investigation made no progress. The investigators' attention was drawn by the fact that Alfredo Garavito was born in the same place where, according to him, the murders were committed, in Genoa. He also gave his address in Trujillo, a town where a grave was also found. He also fitted the suspect profile perfectly according to his characteristics. He wore glasses, was the right height and age, and was on the list of 24 suspects because of Ronaldo's case. His exact location was not known. It was then decided to check the last address in his file. It turned out to be his sister's address. His sister said she hadn't seen him for a long time, but he had left a bag full of things at the last meeting. The sister had it examined. Many clues were found there. Diaries in which, according to the police, Garavito told them about each of his victims. They contained the names of many missing children, dates and places. There were also newspaper clippings about the missing persons. The more the police investigated Alfredo Garavito, the clearer it became that he was the murderer. Transfer papers were found in the bag, according to which Garavito had transferred money to his girlfriend in another municipality. When the police recognized this girlfriend's address, they went to her. She said that the man had already left and that she hadn't heard from him for a long time. But he had left a small suitcase. This suitcase contained more diaries and newspaper cuttings. Some things were found that pointed to Garavito's guilt. He was obviously very interested in these disappearances and also noted certain dates and places in his diaries. Religious books were also found in the suitcase. A Bible, a book on Satanism, and a book on naturopathy. Bus tickets were also found. With their help, it was possible to better understand which path the man was following. It became clear that the man went to Bereda after leaving his victim in Palmyra. The investigators returned to Bereda and began asking pharmacies and hospitals if they had treated a man with recent burns. An employee at a pharmacy said yes. A man with a burn on his leg had recently come to them. It was not a local man. The employee had never seen him before. After receiving help, the man did not return. Although the police joined forces, it seemed as if too much time had passed and they could not arrest anyone. They tracked down Luis Alfredo Garavito, but then they lost his trail in Bereda. They didn't know if the man was there or had gone somewhere else. Another message arrived. In Ecuador, near the border with Colombia, bodies of children with the same characteristics were found. It was determined that the man was expanding the scope of his crimes. By April 22nd, on 999, there was no new information on the case. In Villavicencio in eastern Bogotá, a boy named Ivan Sabural went missing. His mother went to the police to file a report. In the morning, the child went to the park to sell lottery tickets, but he didn't come home at lunchtime. Time passed. The mother was very frightened and decided to go to the police together with her husband. Both parents were told that they would be helped. During the night of the same day, the police received a call. A girl who worked at the bus station said that a boy had arrived. He was half naked and looked very distressed. She said the child had asked for help. He said a man tried to do something terrible to him, but he was rescued by a tramp. Ivan told this when the police took him back to his mother. He was selling lottery tickets in the park when a middle-aged man approached him. He offered the boy money in return for a job in the countryside. They arrived at the place, but there was neither money nor work. The man told the boy to go into the bush. There he told him to undress and started touching him. At this point, the tramp who was following them realized what was going on. The boy began to scream, and the tramp became even more disturbed. He started throwing stones at the man. The man fled. The tramp and the boy ran to the bus stop where they asked for help. This incident helped the investigation a lot. When Ivan and his mother went to the police station, accompanied by police officers to give evidence, the man came out of the bushes towards them. The boy recognized him immediately. It was the same man. The police asked him several times if he was sure. The boy said yes. The man was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. He said his name was Bonifacio Marrero and showed his identity card. It was determined that Bonifacio was very similar to Luis Alfredo Garavito. They also noticed that the man's signature did not look like his identity card. He signed about 5 documents at the police station, and the signature was different each time. He also fit the profile of the suspect. Right age, height, build. He also walked with a limp sometimes. But Bonifacio was not on the list of the 2 suspects. The police could not initially accuse him of all the crimes under investigation. He could only be sent to prison for the crime against Ivan. There he awaited trial. At that time, all the investigators working on missing children cases came together. When they saw the photo of Bonifacio, they realized that it was indeed Luis Alfredo Garavito. The man looked almost identical. The problem was that they didn't want him to know that they had already picked up his scent. They had to do a DNA test to find the matches. The man was examined by an eye doctor who checked to see if the glasses found at one of the crime scenes matched him. While he was at the ophthalmologist, the police officers went into his cell and took several hairs from his pillow. Then fingerprints were taken to compare with Garavito's fingerprints. The results of all the tests showed that Bonifacio Marrero was indeed Luis Alfredo Garavito. In a Dutch program, a very advanced one for the time, all the places where there had been murders and all the places where Garavito and those of the suspects had been were put in. The program showed that only Luis Alfredo Garavito visited all the places where the crimes happened. There was no doubt that they arrested the biggest child murderer in history. The police wanted to extract a confession from him. The most important thing they wanted from him was for the man to say where the other children were. The number of victims was already very large, and the police were sure that there were indeed more. So it was important for Luis Alfredo to admit that he had committed all these crimes, to ask him if he had done this to anyone else. That was very difficult. During the first interrogations, Garavito seemed rather flippant. He showed no emotion, let alone regret. Getting a confession from this man was a very difficult task. The police began to investigate who Luis Alfredo Garavito was, where he was born, where he grew up, but above all, at what point he stopped being a normal human being and turned into a monster. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cuvillos was born on January 25, 1957, in Genova, Quindio, Colombia. In a family that lived in the countryside and brought in coffee. It was a large family. Garavito was the eldest of 7 children. His father was Manuel Antonio Garavito, and his mother was Rosa Abelia Cuvillos. It is known that Manuel Antonio Garavito was very strict and cruel with his children. He often used corporal punishment. He was strictest with Luis Alfredo, perhaps because he was the eldest, maybe because of something else. Garavito said that his father beat him hard and often. He also once said that his father had abused him. He often went to the bathroom with him under the pretext that he was washing his son. But he actually touched him in the bathroom and forced him to touch him. He said that this experience had a strong impact on his life. He also said that he had been raped since childhood by an acquaintance, a friend of his father, the owner of a pharmacy. When his mother took him to this pharmacy for a medical examination, this man took advantage of the situation. Alfredo said that this man not only raped him, but also tortured him. He inflicted wounds with a knife, beat him on his hands and legs, and also burned him with candle wax. According to Alfredo, it took 2 years for his family to move from Genova to Trujillo. But even after that, his life did not improve. He said another friend of his father's also started raping him. This man came to their house at night and took the boy to pastures or other remote places. He was abused there. Alfredo said this also affected him a lot. When he became a teenager, he felt a desire towards his younger brothers. He wanted to do the same thing that was done to him. He was 15 years old when the terrible thing almost happened. He was at the train station when he noticed a boy who caught his attention. Alfredo told the boy he would give him money if he would help him load. He actually took him around the corner. The police heard the child's screams and immediately rushed to help. Although he had not done anything to the boy, he was taken to the police station for attempted abuse. As he was a minor, they called his father. That day, his father used violence and told him to look for women for something like that. Luis Alfredo said that his relationship with his father at that point had gotten worse than it was, and he left the house as a minor. That's how his bum life began.
Worst way to
He
live.
said that in the first few years after he left home, he had a mistress with whom he allegedly had a son. During the subsequent investigation, it turned out that this child was not his, but for several years he looked after it as if it were his. Luis Alfredo also said that over the years he could not imagine having a relationship with women. He began to think that he only liked men. He did not speak freely about his orientation because he was afraid that he would not be accepted and would be laughed at. He also couldn't talk about the fact that he was attracted to young boys. After breaking up with this woman, he traveled to another place and left her behind with the child. He moved to Armenia, a city in Colombia, and started a new life there. There he began his terrifying life. When he saw children sleeping on the street on his way to work, he would offer them some money in return for his satisfaction. He drank heavily and became a member of Alcoholics Anonymous at the age of 23. He received psychiatric treatment there. He was supposedly cured after 2 weeks. But this was very far from reality. Luis Alfredo Garavito continued to drink. He had a routine. He went to work, then drank, and looked for children at night. And he did this almost every day. He said he did it with at least 200 boys between the ages of 20 and 30. He reached the peak of his criminal activity at the age of 27. He was brought to the Alcoholics Anonymous Center again, this time for the last time. After 38 days he was released and was again told he was healthy. He began to drink compulsively again and committed his first murder shortly before his 30th birthday. He said that on that day he had been drinking as usual in a pub next to the park when he saw a boy who caught his attention. He offered the boy money in return for a job and took him to a secluded area. The boy walked very slowly, and on the way there the man was able to go into a store and buy 3 things: a knife, a rope, and a bottle of strong alcohol. The same bottle and rope that was then found in all the other places. Although he said he had only taken a knife and rope for intimidation, at some point he hit the boy. Then he realized that it gave him great pleasure. He started inflicting more and more wounds until the boy stopped breathing. The boy named Carlos was Luis Alfredo Garavito's first victim. Thus began a nightmare that lasted 6 years and affected the whole of Colombia. After committing this crime, the man began traveling through different areas of Valle del Cauca. The first murder took place in 1992, and by 1993, his methods had become even more refined, and he himself became even more cruel. He no longer picked up every boy in the park, but tracked down his victims. He knew where they lived, what their parents' names were, and what they did for a living. He knew whether the children had siblings. For him, it was a hunt. He moved through the country without arousing any suspicion. He dressed like a homeless person or a priest to deceive the people in the villages and create more trust among the children. Everything he did was documented in his diaries. Dates, names, places. Everything was carefully recorded. These diaries represented the life of Luis Alfredo Garavito. They documented the last 6.5 years. He said he had tried to become religious because he felt bad about what he was doing. He tried occultism, Satanism, and other alternative religions, but none of them could free him from his criminal desires. He said he wanted revenge on the world for everything that had happened to him as a child. He claimed that he had inflicted the same wounds on his victims that he had suffered as a child, especially the injuries inflicted by candle wax. He often took candles with him, lit them, and inflicted burns on the children. According to him, the same thing was done to him as a child when he was raped, after he had confessed everything and told where he had buried the first victims. It became clear that the number of victims had risen to 200. Plus, 200 more children he raped, but didn't kill. In total, there were about 400 injured. He gained the title of the greatest serial killer of children in history. He also claimed to have acted not only in Colombia, but also in some cities in Ecuador, on the border with Colombia. Although it was a much-discussed trial and many charges were brought against him, the sentence was not severe enough. He allegedly received more than 1,800 years in prison for all the crimes, but due to some laws, the prison time was shortened. Firstly, there is no life sentence in Colombia. No one can be in prison for life, unless you die in a fight or in another accident. The maximum prison term is 60 years. These 60 years were reduced by 20 years because Luis Alfredo Garavito cooperated with the police and told them where the rest of the burials were. For this, the public prosecutor's office had to reduce his prison sentence, and it was done. In the end, the man only had to serve 40 years in prison. The verdict was announced 2001. But then there seemed to be another problem. There was a law that prisoners who are rehabilitated after serving 60% of their prison time can be released. Garavito can be considered rehabilitated after all the time he spent in prison. He began attending church, was baptized in prison, claimed he had changed and was very sorry for his crimes. He also graduated from high school. Coupled with good behavior, this all made him a great candidate to be released after serving 60% of his prison sentence. This law doesn't say that it doesn't apply to inmates who committed violent crimes, so Luis Alfredo can go ahead and try to use that, which his lawyer is actually doing. The perpetrator gave 2 major interviews on television, one for the Spanish media, the other for the Colombian media. In one of these interviews, he said he suffered from erectile dysfunction and had never raped the children he killed. This was strange because in another interview he said the opposite. Should I be afraid of you? Of me? No. No. You are one of the greatest serial killers in history. I did things that go against the law and moral standards. I'm just a human being who has made mistakes like everyone else. But am I dangerous? No, I don't think so at the moment. When you talk about unjustified acts, what do you mean? Murders? Yes, of course. How many rapes are we talking about? I can't remember the exact number. About over 100. Do you know the exact locations of most of the grave sites? I didn't bury any victims. I just left them all on the surface. I never buried them. Garavito contradicted himself on many points in 2 interviews. Mostly bones were found. How is one going to analyze 20 to 30 bone remains? They lay for a year or 2. There was no more meat. Nothing more. How can doctors determine whether the victims were raped or not? I have erectile dysfunction. So I didn't do it. The murders are brought to court. That's normal. But for the rest, only God can judge me. In the year of May, Luis Alfredo Garavito has the opportunity to claim his freedom. Many see this as disrespect to all families who continue to mourn their children. It is also disrespect to the victims, both for those who are no longer alive and for those who are still with us and suffering the consequences. He bit me all over my body. I cried, screamed. He told me not to scream. He threatened. I was scared. He put me face down on the floor. He took a knife and inflicted 6 or 7 wounds on me. I was tied up without food. He tortured me. He burned me with candles. He cut me with a knife. He bit me. On the 3rd day he abused me. Before I ran away he abused me several times. There are also indirect victims, not just children and their families. As you remember, there were people who went to prison for these crimes. For example, the man called Radzia Dinoco. He spent a lot of time in prison, almost 4 years, for a crime that Garavito, as it turned out, had committed. There, without knowing it, Dinoco came face to face with the real madman. It happened in prison. There they met, and Dinoco said that Garavito asked him for forgiveness. Of course he replied that he could not forgive him because he was not only destroying his life, but also the lives of many children. Because of the way other prisoners treated him, Dinoco developed schizophrenia. Although he was released, he could no longer lead a normal life. He couldn't find a job, he had no money, he often slept in the garbage or under bridges. He took a lot of medication. After his release from prison, he was not the man he once was. His lawyer filed a lawsuit. This resulted in him receiving compensation of 1 million. But according to Javier Garcia Dinoco, he did not receive a cent of this amount. He begs, sells second-hand goods and helps neighbors. His life was completely destroyed. The first 7 days in prison were normal, but then a guard came with a newspaper in his hand and showed a photo. He said, "Look who's so beautiful here." I was caught by 80 other prisoners. I was kicked, beaten with fists, beaten with sticks. I spent almost a year in another prison, also suffering. I was not allowed to come for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. I was put in a cell where the water was up to my ankles. There was no place to sleep. I was sick. Knives were thrown at me through the bars. Luis Alfredo Garavito was given many different nicknames. The monster from Renoir, La Bestia, Tribilin, the priest, What didn't change was the harm he did to his victims. It's worth remembering that, because he will soon be released. Now he's doing everything he can to get out of prison. He's pretty sure it will be a success, but it's very likely that he'll start committing crimes again, looking for boys. He may go to year off, but nobody knows what will really happen. What is clear is that when he gets out of prison for the year off, he only had to serve 2 months for every boy killed and raped. Obviously, that is not enough. The families of the victims are trying to prevent this. Luis Alfredo Raravito caused horror throughout the country. This is one of the most gruesome cases published on this channel. And it's not just Luis's crimes that are horrific, but also the injustice for which he has the right to get out of prison in a year. Many people know that, and one can only hope that the police will not allow him to go free and serve at least another 20 years. The relatives of the boys who were killed and mutilated are fighting for this. He says he has changed. He believes in God and has been baptized. Many believe that it is just a cover to show people that things have gotten better. Yet many people believe that evil of this kind never disappears from a person.